Indians have a very different epistemic cultural system than Chinese do. And these two big ones, if you can't get the two big ones together, the littler ones, probably Koreans are closer to Chinese, but boy, Koreans have spent 1,500 years fighting off the Chinese and the Japanese, and for them not to get their own, they wouldn't accept that. You see what I'm saying? So it's just for these political reasons, they're happy to go Asian mental health. In terms of an indigenous psychology, it's not coherent. There is no Asian indigenous psychology. There may be a Chinese indigenous psychology. There may be a Korean indigenous psychology. There may be a Māori indigenous psychology. But the Asian one, it just encompasses too much difference to make coherent. So this is kind of one of the kind of limiting conditions on how many indigenous psychologies there are. It's just that when Indians start talking about certain things, like they are really deeply in this metaphysical stuff, about Atman and all this kind of stuff. They are the masters of meditation. Now there's an extent to which that came over the Himalayas and took very deep roots in China, because Buddhism would still be the largest religion in China. It's from India originally. Chinese are really different. They're not metaphysically focused. They're Confucianists, so they're relationally focused. So you build the indigenous psychologies on different bases. Now, if you can identify the cultural basis on which you can build the indigenous psychology, that tells you if you have an indigenous psychology or not. So the Indians very clearly can say, our indigenous psychology is built around the philosophical system of the Vedas, and it spreads out from there. The Chinese can say it's built on the philosophical system of Confucianism and legalism, and it spreads out from there. So it's very clear that those are indigenous psychologies. I think Māori can do that as well. But it's much harder to say, is Sioux sufficiently different from Blackfoot that you have a different philosophical basis to build it? Because if you don't, then you're dividing your resources too much. So this is a really central issue. The Philippines would be a perfect example. I don't see little itty-bitty indigenous psychology movements popping up in the Philippines, even though there are hundreds of languages. Because one, there is no really strong indigenous philosophy or tradition of knowledge in the Philippines. So they don't have this thing where they can say, okay, this group builds from this group builds from that. Enriquez, who's the father of it, is trying to generate a system, but that system, it's not like it's rooted way back here or way back here, so that this group would say, no, our system is like this, and that group would say, no, our system is like that. And so what I see in the Philippines is it is coming up as a Filipino indigenous psychology, as opposed to a Mindanao indigenous psychology and a Visayans indigenous psychology and a Central Luzon indigenous psychology. So you see, it's based around two things. There's some practicalities of mobilizing resources, and then also this issue of how strong are the cultural similarities versus differences. So to me, those are the major factors that determine how many indigenous psychologies we have. And these are dynamic kind of factors. There's a significant amount of fuzziness in deciding this. So right now, there is, for instance, a movement in Taiwan to create a Taiwanese indigenous psychology. Now, can anybody tell me the reasons why for that? Culturally, same basis, same language, same whatever. Anybody?
Just to be different?
Why do they just want to be different?
So that they can have another method.
People always do things for a reason. They do want to be different. Why do they want to be different? On what basis do they want to be different? No one knows. Guess.
Political?
Yes.
But I don't know.
It's for political reasons. The reason is Taiwan would like to be a sovereign state. And so to back your idea of being a sovereign state, you have to claim difference. So they will claim, for instance, that their language is Taiwanese. Now Taiwanese is the Mingnan dialect from Fujian. Okay? So, but they will claim that it's Taiwanese. I have my friend Dennis Hilton, and he always says, what's the difference between a dialect and a language? Anybody know? He says this, that the language has an army and a navy. And Floor should smile especially, because the difference between Dutch and German is probably less than the difference between the Beijing dialect and the Mingnan or the Fujian dialect. Okay? And they have an army and navy. You're an island, you have an army and navy, you claim the language. It's really happening right now in the former Yugoslavia, by the way. Some of these groups that have been killing each other are really separating, and they'll reify that their languages are different, even though it's like a few syllables here and there, and they're fairly intelligible to one. So that's another principle of indigeneity that is this political, realpolitik. It's not pretty. You know, it's about political power. So that's another thing. That's another thing that feeds into this issue. And certainly in the Philippines, there's a strong anti-colonial movement, and the anti-colonial movements are often used to produce a superordinate category to bind the people of the state together. So historically, Filipinos from the different parts of the Philippines would have considered themselves very different. The Spaniards certainly erased some of that difference, but then once that was gone, they're trying to mobilize it politically to be one state. Same thing with India. This is attempt to create a Hindu or Hindu-Indian nationals to kind of bind that together. So there's an Indian indigenous psychology. But if there's any big state that could justifiably produce several indigenous psychologies, that would be India. But I don't see that coming up. Again, for probably political reasons. You know, because the differences in culture and language between North India and South India are massive. Because North India has the Mughal or the Muslim heritage, and South India doesn't. And so those are real different, but you don't see an indigenous psychology for South India versus North India, because the state is a thing that people are trying to reify and straighten out. Okay? Does that clarify things for you around the first question? Is there any further kind of things you want to talk about the first question? You see there is no answer. It all depends on what it is that you want to achieve in your knowledge and in your politics.
So the answer to the first question was about creating the argument for a particular position.
That's right. You just have to develop your... So again, now what I'm looking for is not the right answer, is exactly what Kiri is saying, is that you have to put together the logic of your argument. Both of them are correct. The Philippines could have just one indigenous psychology if this is what you're trying to achieve, or it could have multiple indigenous psychologies if that is what you're trying to achieve. So that's what I'm saying. There is no one answer, but you're trying to put together the logic of whatever it is that you are trying to achieve in creating something like this.
I think when, and not everyone else says this, but when you start looking at the whole indigenous psychology thing on, you know, how many there should be, I think I sort of feel like, oh, I don't want to offend people by leaving them out and assuming that they're all the same. Like, you know, I think, oh yeah, Pacific culture, and then it's like, well, there's so many different people in Pacific groups, and I don't want to leave people out. And, you know, you look at, like you're saying, there's non-indigenous Asian psychology, and it's like, well, yeah, because there's all these different countries, and you don't want to offend people by making these assumptions, and it makes it really difficult because it's like, well, how small do you go? And I think I feel a bit more clear about that now, but I think that's something that is maybe a struggle from being part of a dominant Western psychology.